Tom is actually spending enough money on defending us, with the man who wrote today's Strategic Defence Review, an exclusive interview with Lord George Robertson. We'll also be discussing the extraordinary and audacious Ukrainian drone attack on Russian airfields, whether a conviction for burning the Quran opens the way to a blasphemy law in this country again, and asking whether new flight paths across the UK are something to be celebrated or worried about. It's all up in the air. Join me after the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, the Defence Secretary says plans to develop new technology will improve the military and keep the UK safe from potential threats. The Strategic Defence Review has been outlined in the Commons, which contains proposals to combine AI with drones, tanks and artillery. There's also an aim to boost Army personnel to 676,000 full-time soldiers over the next 4 years. John Healey's told MPs it's crucial the government acts now.
Our adversaries are working more in alliance with one another, while technology is changing the way war is fought. We are in a new era of threat, which demands a new era for UK defence.
A second round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have ended with no major breakthrough. The two sides have agreed a prisoner swap during discussions in Turkey. A man is due in court in the US, charged over an attack on a demonstration in support of Israeli hostages. 8 people were injured in Boulder, Colorado yesterday. And British number 3, Cameron Norrie, is out of the French Open. He lost in straight sets in the 4th round to 3-time champion Novak Djokovic. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 1 point at 87.74. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.18. LBC weather: heavy rain and gusty winds pushing east across much of the UK tonight. Scattered showers to follow, but staying dry for the southeast. Lows of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. At one level, of course, it all seems completely mad. In a country struggling to find the money for policing or doctors or help for the poorest, we are today deciding to buy weirdly shaped ships and nuclear-powered submarines, obscenely expensive jets and all manner of drones and missiles and other kit. And we're doing this because we don't want to use them. We want them to sit in their bases and their hangars, slowly accumulating rust and quickly becoming obsolete, until we dismantle them again and break them up and melt them down into something else. It seems mad. But of course it's not mad, because today's Defence Review is about one thing and one thing only: credibility. We need to be able to persuade potential enemies, the Russians in particular, that we are too dangerous to attack. Now, that is probably not the case today, but perhaps within a few years it will be. I have got nothing against the Russians as a people. They are brave, cultured and hardy. But domination by the Kremlin dictatorship would destroy everything that is valuable in this country. We couldn't speak or hear freely. The brave would be imprisoned and the rest of us would live in perpetual fear. For my money, and it is my money just like it's your money, I'm prepared to spend more on weird, scary things I hope turn out to be useless in order to keep that possibility away from my children. The question today is how much more the government is prepared to spend, because most experts I read don't think that 2.5% of GDP by 2027 is enough. 3% by 2034 is an aspiration, it's not a commitment. Other countries like Denmark and Lithuania, which is on the front line, are talking about much more quickly. Frankly, we should be doing the same. And that is one of the many questions to discuss with the man who authored today's report that everybody has been talking about. I'm joined tonight exclusively by Lord George Robertson, himself, of course, a former Defence Secretary and former Secretary-General of NATO. George, it's great to have you in the show. Straightforward question. Are we ready to fight a war today?
No, we're probably not. We're hollowed out forces, but then we're not facing an enemy today. in conventional terms, we're facing an enemy that is working against us all the time. Cyber attacks, assassinations, election interference, disinformation campaigns. Our enemies are at our door. They're already there. And when you've got a question about welfare or warfare, what happens if a cyber attack stops our hospitals from working? What if it turns our power off? What happens if it stops the police cars in the street? These things are real and alive, and in some cases are actually happening today.
So today it's not really a choice between guns or butter. Because of the situation we're in, we do need both. And this is a review that you have written, which covers 10 years. But everything that I hear and everything that you've been saying suggests this is a very urgent question as well.
There is an urgency about the way in which the Russians especially, and others as well, are ganging up on us and using different means. Now, it might well be that what we're seeing in Ukraine today could be the nature of war in the future. Ukraine might actually be yesterday's war. Tomorrow's war could be much nastier, much crueler, much more brutal. And when you see, as you said in your opening introduction, what happens when an aggressor like the Russians take over a country, it's a pretty miserable, brutal existence that comes from there. So it'll take some time for our adversaries to build up capabilities. But in the meantime, we've got to build up our capabilities and deal also with the national resilience, the homeland defence that we've got to build up in order to deal with the grey zone attacks that we're already experiencing.
I want to come on to the Homeland Defence specifically, but when you took on this job many months ago, you did it in the context of a 2.5% commitment on defence. And, we look around us just now, we've got General Dannett, we've got Paul Johnson of the IFS, many, many more saying that's not going to be enough. We're going to have to raise more money. Do you think we're going to have to raise more money than we are at the moment for defence?
We'll only be able to raise it if the people of this country want the insurance policy that is represented by defence. That's what it is. You're quite right to say a lot of these weapons we hope will never be used, but they're there as a deterrent. The guys with the machine guns standing outside Downing Street could cause mayhem if they were to use them, but they're there in order to stop anybody thinking about attacking Downing Street, and that is exactly what we need to do in terms of the defence of this country. A deterrent is what is needed, and that's what we're saying. We've got to build up war-fighting abilities now that we never had in the past, never needed in the last 50 years. We've got to build that up in order that an adversary, a potential adversary, means that it's too expensive to attack us.
Let's come on to some of the specifics that this discusses, because without chilling anybody listening too much, the report describes how an attack upon the country by another state might start and might develop. And in that, you talk about missile attacks on our critical infrastructure, which leads me to ask, can you explain to people listening whether we are going to get more effective missile defences for the homeland?
Well, there are limited defences at the moment, but they couldn't sustain a major attack on us. But that is not likely at this precise moment. But we're starting to make the investment about an integrated air and missile defence for this country. So there's some seed corn investment going to be made. But by and large, it's going to have to be done on a NATO level. And other countries are themselves investing and thinking about investing about it. But it's a big project, an expensive project, but we're starting on it.
So, Israel has its Iron Dome. Donald Trump is talking about a Golden Dome or something over the United States. We would have some kind of all-Western European dome or system, would we, that we would be part of?
Some of the countries have already got Patriot missile systems, so there are limited engagements there. But that's something that NATO is thinking about very closely at the moment. So in the review, we make an initial investment in this area.
And it's not very large, is it? It's about £1 billion for the whole thing.
Yeah, but it's a start on what would be ultimately a very, very expensive system. But it's one of those things that if in the future people want to be properly defended, the people of this country want, the insurance policy that defence represents, then they'll need to vote and articulate a view that says we want to be safer than we are.
You see, this brings me back a little bit to the money here, because as the more I listen to this, the more I wonder whether this is the beginning of a conversation which is going to lead to either more borrowing. Lord Hayne, Peter Hayne, former colleague, has suggested war bonds or defence bonds of a kind we saw after the Second World War as a way of raising more money for defence, or more taxation. Paul Johnson, I mentioned him earlier, has been talking about a pretty chunky extra amount of tax to pay for this. Are we beginning a conversation which could lead through an election to either more tax or more borrowing on defence?
Well, I don't know, because I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm not even a minister. All we done was asked as a former Secretary General of NATO and a former Defence Secretary to look at defence in this country and to listen to every conceivable opinion about it. So it's boiled down to these pages as well. But at the end of the day, if the people of this country want an insurance policy, want to be safe, want to make sure that their children in the future are going to be safe, then tough decisions will have to be made. The Prime Minister's already made a very, very tough decision for a Labour Prime Minister, which is to say we're going to cut the aid budget in order to give the Ministry of Defence more money. That took a lot of toughness. At the NATO summit, a lot of countries round the table are going to be saying if we're going to get to 2% or 3% or the reputed 3.5%, then a lot of social programmes may well have to go. But if we're going to be safe and we're not going to have the lights turned off, then people will have to pay.
Let's return to some of the specifics, because there has been much talk about up to a dozen nuclear-powered attack submarines. What are they there to attack? What are they there to defend?
We depend in this country on undersea cables and undersea pipelines. Over 70% of the data that we use in this country comes from undersea cables. Over 70% of our gas supplies, on which we depend for heating, comes from one pipeline from Norway. So submarines are actually the protection for the future. And therefore, submarine warfare is a big, big issue. That's why the Russians and others and the Chinese are investing hugely in that. And we've got to keep up with them in order to make sure that we're protected.
We have talked about our undersea cable vulnerabilities on this programme, I think, before. I've certainly talked about it with various people, including General Petraeus. Do you think this review will at least properly protect us in a way that we haven't been before?
Well, we'll go towards the protection that is going to be necessary. That's why there's a lot of serious recommendations in here. The government have accepted all 62 recommendations in this report. The Prime Minister has himself personally accepted the report in its entirety. It's very detailed, and it's got a lot of substance to it. A lot of the stuff will bear a lot of reading in order to do it, but we're making a start. It's a 10-year programme. It's a strategic defence review, not a review for the moment and for next year. It's after that, and it's for your children and your grandchildren that we're thinking about when we wrote this.
The Prime Minister has come under quite a lot of attack today for being, as it were, all mouth and no trousers, not really putting the amount of money in that's going to be needed to do what he says is needed. Do you think that he himself has a personal commitment to this that will in the end, will look back and say, actually, they did put in the money?
I was in the shipbuilding hall today in government, and I heard him speak with commitment and indeed with passion about the need to protect this country, that being the first responsibility of government. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. He said he was 100% confident that we would reach the 3%. The Defence Secretary has just told the House of Commons that the money will be found in order to implement the Strategic Defence Review. And I think, the public listens to that. Remember, this is a UK defence review. I asked a former Conservative Defence Minister, one of the best, to be part of my team doing this. Sir Jeremy Quinn has been part of our team all along. So this is not a Labour review. It is not
a party
designed
political
by
thing.
that. The three reviewers, we're not partisan. It's for the country.
We are unusual in this country in only having one delivery system for our nuclear deterrence. Is that good enough?
Well, it's fundamental, and I can tell you, I've been in the Kremlin
one delivery system
a number of times with President Putin, and I know what moves the dial inside the Kremlin. And Britain's independent strategic nuclear deterrent is there. Now, in the report we say, let's look at what what NATO does. They're the dual-capable aircraft who are carrying individual bombs. We did away with them. In fact, I did away with them in 1998. You know,
You regret it?
The French have. No, I don't regret doing that at all. The world has changed since I did that, and I did that review.
So do you think it's possible? I know the decision has not yet been taken, but do you think it's possible going forward that we will have American F-35s carrying nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't know, because that's just one of the issues that says we should debate and discuss it and do it with our NATO colleagues. You know, the French are now talking about their independent deterrent, and they've got, free-fall bombs as well, being committed to the European Union. So there's a big debate going on about nuclear forces. We'll see what that leads to.
Quite a lot of people listening to this, George, will think, you know what, they all have a point. This is a really serious moment in the national story, and I'd like to do my bit. Now, for younger people, for fitter people, just explain a little bit about this idea of, as it were, a gap year military service.
Well, we want to give young people a sense of what the military is about. So there's a whole series of recommendations in here, including the gap year, for people who might want to go in and try what it's like and might be entranced by it, might be attracted to it, when they're only watching external propaganda or external publicity. So, you know, we brought in innovative things that you have one entry point.
30% increase in cadets.
Absolutely. You know, I was an army cadet and I hated every single minute I was in it. And when I was defence secretary...
So was I, and so did I.
Well, I don't, but when I was defence secretary, I remembered my memory of that, and we reformed it and we changed it. It's a very, very different organisation now in each of the three services. And it's a wonderful way of young people learning how the defence of their country involves them as well. And one of the key lessons of this review is going to be that we all have a responsibility. We can't contract out the defence of the country, you know, to people who are in uniform. We've all got a responsibility. It's a whole of country endeavour, and we need to involve people. And the cadets is one way of getting young people to recognise what they can do, you know, to help their country.
And another way might be that it's been described as a kind of updated dad's army, but some kind of homeland defence force to protect military critical infrastructure around the country.
During the COVID pandemic, if you remember, there was a call for people to help the NHS. Thousands of people volunteered, said that they would become part of this sort of paramedical army that was there. They were never used. But I think that there is a genuine feeling in the community, you know, that the defence of the nation is something that's to be shared. So we'll look at how best we can enlist, you know, people in order to be able to sort of monitor, watch what our critical national infrastructure is. You know, a few weeks ago, Spain and Portugal were brought to a standstill by a power cut. There was no power in two modern European countries, and everything was brought to a standstill. You know, a few weeks ago, Heathrow Airport was stopped by one explosion in one transmitter. You know, so these things are happening today, and our adversaries are learning how vulnerable our infrastructure actually is. And a cyber attack that cut off power to the National Health Service would drive it home to people brutally about what the threats are to the country today.
And brutally, we don't have enough full-time soldiers to protect every piece of infrastructure all the time. So is your idea that, as it were, part-time soldiers or territorial army people or whatever will be there in greater numbers to do that job?
Well, we want to enlist people. We'll have a debate. I hope that there's going to be a national conversation anyway. The Prime Minister's made it clear, and we propose it in this document, a national conversation about defence and security. How can everybody be involved? And as part of that conversation, then we'll look at how vulnerable, you know, our electricity supplies are, our telecoms, our water supplies are, our gas supplies are, our data headquarters are. If you cut off the air conditioning in some of the big data centres, the clouds, you know, everything melts. So, you know,
I hope the Kremlin is not listening too carefully to our conversation
I'm
here.
not telling the Kremlin anything they don't already know, and that's the worry. They know an awful lot about our vulnerabilities, and what we've got to do now is make sure that they're protected.
Trying to take the bigger picture, we've had Putin and the Ukraine war. We've had Donald Trump and what he has said about NATO. Do you think this is a hinge moment in the national story, as it were, a moment when we change our attitude to our own defence once and for all?
I think we do. I think we're at a moment in time where people begin to realise what the threat is, both from what they call the sub-threshold, the grey zone, the cyber attacks, and also what's happened to Ukraine, where a massive neighbour decides that it will crush and brutally subordinate a neighbouring nation state. So that's the point where I think people have got to recognise, if you don't have an insurance policy for your home, you're less vulnerable. If you don't have an insurance policy for your country, then what will happen is what happened in Ukraine. The citizens, the ordinary people in Bucha and in Mariupol used to walk the streets, just like I did today, coming from Parliament across here to Millbank, in peace and security. And the next day they weren't. The next day the Russians had invaded and they were enslaved, their children taken away to another country, tortured, brutalised in that country. So it can happen so quickly. And I think we're at the moment in time where, given Ukraine, given the the way in which our adversaries are working together, we've finally recognised that there needs to be a big insurance policy for the country, and it's worth paying for.
Finally, one of the things that the Ukrainians managed to do is to achieve a drone industry almost from scratch. I mean, they've been much more successful, frankly, than we have been at building drones at scale and innovatively. And they've had the extraordinary attack on Russia yesterday, overnight. In the past, we've had defence reviews, and really what we have done is we have gone around the world and bought off the shelf from other people the kit that we needed. This time around, are we going to build them here?
I hope we do. And we make proposals here, for radically changing the procurement way in which we do things. If it takes too cumbersome, too slow, too difficult for small companies to get involved, they'll find, if they read this, that we've got a whole new series of organisations that have been set up in order to capture the innovation, to move quickly, in peacetime, but at wartime rates. And that's the way in which you can capture the innovation. So that what the Ukrainians are doing today is moving at pace and inventing things very, very quickly. And what we saw the other day in that remarkable assault on the Russian strategic bombers, is an indication of how quickly you've got to move. So people in the future, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force of the future, is going to have to be one step ahead. And that's what this report is all about.
Final question, George. You have been living this stuff now very intensively for many months. Most of us don't even like to think about it. When you've been dreaming about it, do you wake up scared or do you wake up confident?
I worry. I'm an optimist that worries. I think that was what Madeleine McCann once said. I think we can do better. I think if we go down this route, having looked at all of the facts and the figures, read all the 8,000 submissions that we got, talked to people, listened to people, scrubbed it all together, and boiled it down to that. If we do these things, then we'll be a safe nation. If we don't do it, I think we're vulnerable. So it is a hinge moment. You've got to make a decision. The country's got to make a decision, and this is the time to make it.
George Robertson, Lord Robertson, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in. If anyone's wondering, it's a really good read, and you should go out there and get a copy and read the report for yourself. And I'd like your reports on what Lord Robertson has just had to say, that extraordinary interview, and the Defence Review more broadly. Would you accept higher taxes to increase our defence spending and make us safer? Do text on 84850 or email marr@lbc.co.uk. Now let's hear from LBC's political correspondent Aggie, who has spent the day combing through Lord Robertson's 48,000 words. Good for you, Aggie. Well done indeed. So what did you make, first of all, of what you just heard?
I think it is concerning that Lord Robertson told you that everything he said, which is concerning in itself, Putin already knows. And that's very much what you get the sense of with these 48,000 words, that there is a huge amount that the country needs to do before it will be safe. And that's essentially what Lord Robertson said to you. There's obviously been this conversation today about 3%, whether or not 2.5% of GDP is enough. And I wasn't completely clear from what Lord Robertson said to you on whether he thinks that was enough or not. He was very, very diplomatic.
He was very
about
diplomatic.
it.
He's a former politician.
He knew exactly what he was doing.
He's waving at us as he leaves the studio.
He is indeed. But
I think he thinks it's not enough. I think he wants more spending. But you're right. You'd have to be Delphic to work it out.
I think that's right. And I thought it was really interesting that you started off by saying, are we ready to fight a war today? And his answer was no. And, you know, he said basically we're facing an enemy that's fighting with cyber attacks, with assassinations, and talked about the urgency that is already exists. And, you know, I think it will be concerning for people who are arguing for that 3% already, when obviously at the moment Sir Keir Starmer's committed to 2.5% and 3% at some stage, maybe in 2034, an ambition.
Someday, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. But I thought what he was saying about enlisting people was really interesting, because people have basically said, you know, push back against the idea of conscription. But when I was speaking to somebody earlier after reading the report, they suggested comparisons with something like Wembley during COVID, when they took over Wembley, and getting people from the private sector to come back in and help in wartime, but looking at a different...
Because it's not conscription, is it? It's entirely voluntary, all this.
Exactly, yeah. but looking at basically this new defence readiness bill is what George Robertson suggested in his 48,000 words. And they said basically looking at how you could take someone, voluntary, of course, from the private sector and say, can we borrow you for a year to help with this? Or can we borrow Wembley? But basically writing that into law. So obviously there's a huge amount in this. And fundamentally, one of the things they are trying to look at, as he explained to you there, is how to get more people in, how to keep people, how to sort out that retention crisis too. But I thought that idea about a gap year, which has worked so well in Australia, as they say in the report, was really interesting too, because they want to recruit more people. They want to get 20% more reserves in the 2030s. So big numbers they're trying to get in.
Final question. Labour has traditionally been uneasy about defence and very uneasy about nuclear defence. Talking to Labour MPs, do you think the Prime Minister, Lord Robertson, John Healey have the support of the Parliamentary Labour Party pretty united? I
think they do to a certain extent. And I think when Sir Keir Starmer announced that he was going to go up to 2.5% a little earlier than some Labour MPs expected, people were mostly on board. I think the trouble is when you look at the fact that lots of people want to get to 3% and you hear Lord Robertson saying to you, we need the public on side. We need the public to want this, and it needs the party to want this too. That is going to be difficult, especially when, as you know, Labour MPs want an awful lot from Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, as we both know, it's the beginning of the conversation, not the end. Aggie, Chambre, thank you very much indeed. Now, we were mentioning a little earlier that most extraordinary, audacious and unsettling of recent military operations, the smuggling of drones into Russia by Ukraine and the destruction of Russian cruise missile-capable bombers all over the place as a result. A great victory for Ukraine, very clever, very carefully planned, and Spider's Web, as it was called, is being compared inside Russia to Pearl Harbor. But it does make me wonder whether it's good news for the rest of us that drones can be packed into anonymous lorries, driven anywhere, and then suddenly released unexpectedly. Let's talk now to Robert Tollast, an expert in drones and land warfare at RUSI. How did this compare, I asked him, with other examples of asymmetric warfare?
So in terms of attacking an enemy's air force on the ground with commando raids, special forces raids, obviously people are talking about the SAS in North Africa, very boldly raiding Luftwaffe airfields. You know, in 1964, the Viet Cong destroyed around 30 American airplanes on the ground in the Vietnam War. And of course, Ukraine has been trying very hard with mostly fixed-wing, long-range drones to hit these bases with very mixed success. So you could also recall the Pebble Island raid in the Falklands War in 1982, where the SAS raided Argentine planes on the ground and destroyed them. This is really unprecedented because it's a remote operation. So they've taken this idea of audacious ground raids to hit the enemy air force, where the enemy have an advantage in the air, hit them on the ground, but to do it remotely with drones, getting the commandos out, getting the special operators out of Russia before they could be caught. It's really quite incredible.
One thing that occurs to me, and will occur to a lot of people, Robert, is if it can be done there, it can be done almost anywhere. Pack drones into anonymous-looking lorries, drive them wherever you want, and attack without warning. It's a little bit worrying. Where does the front line happen now?
Yeah, it's very concerning, definitely. And, for a number of years, people have been saying that 20-foot containers, shipping containers that we used to house the drones in this attack by Ukraine, they've been a problem for some time. There are an increasing number of weapon systems that can be put into a shipping container and essentially hidden. And a number of countries have worked on these systems. And essentially, yes, if you have attack drones into the mix, then it's a huge security threat. And absolutely, it's very difficult to defend against. Counter drone technology is something that's still a little bit nascent. There are a lot of solutions in the West, from AI-powered machine guns to microwaves and jamming, essentially. But unless you're extremely vigilant, there is a danger that a determined enemy could get one of those drones through. And we saw that to an extent. I was mentioning ground raids against air bases in 2012. The Taliban attacked Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and destroyed 6 Harrier jets on the ground. If they'd had attack drones then, which they didn't, it could have been much worse. And of course, it's not impossible to imagine that being conducted by a terror group in the West on our own soil, potentially.
Yes, I was going to say, if you're actually in charge of trying to defend RAF Lakenheath or Salisbury Plain or any of the big British military bases in this country, you must be slightly worried this afternoon.
I think so. I mean, I certainly hope that we've been watching lessons from Syria, for example. So small drones were used to attack an airbase there in 2018, a Russian airbase. And of course, the key thing is that we've got our aircraft in hardened shelters as much as possible. And if you go back to the Cold War, this was something that was regularly drilled, just keeping aircraft exposed, vulnerable for the shortest time possible, because of course we knew that our airfields could be targeted with a wide variety of weapons. Of course, now it's drones, and then it was missiles in those times. So in that regard, it's really not. It's not that we're terribly vulnerable, but it's certainly a case of doubling down on our tactics and procedures to make sure that these places are safe. And that will probably come down to a combination of radio frequency jamming, jamming the video links and the control links to drones, and also potentially what they call hard kill measures. Now, of course, in a European country, you don't necessarily want to fire machine guns at drones, of course, where there's civilian population nearby. But there are laser weaponry that can dazzle drones, that can blind the sensors, that would be a lot safer to use near an airbase or a critical infrastructure in the West. And the Israelis have that with their Iron Beam, for example.
Very, very interesting. Final question, Robert. Clearly, this is a huge humiliation for Vladimir Putin and for the Russian military, and there is going to be a retaliation of some kind. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it's hard to say the extent that this has damaged the Russian strategic aviation and nuclear-capable aircraft. There are varying reports of 10% of that fleet to 30% being destroyed of their heavy strategic bombers. In terms of visual losses, it may be a little bit lower than that. I think one of the real depths of destructive power that the Russians still have is the VKS, their aerospace forces. So indeed, they could launch very terrible strikes on Ukraine again, as they have done. Only the other day, they launched nearly 500 drones against targets in Ukraine. So absolutely, there's a lot more damage that they can do. But I think the momentum strategically might be shifting towards Ukraine. I think they're continually out-innovating and out-maneuvering the Russians on the battlefield and what you call the deep strike, which is essentially what this operation was.
Absolutely fascinating. Robert Tollast, thank you so much for talking to LBC.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you.
The revolution is coming, and Reform are kicking it off in Maidstone at Kent County Council. More of that next. But the time now, 6:33, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
One of the authors of the Strategic Defence Review has told LBC if people want to be safe, then they will have to pay. Lord George Robertson has been speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr as the government reveals its plans to step up UK spending. Delegations from Russia and Ukraine have ended their latest peace talks in Turkey after just over an hour with no major breakthrough. The two sides have agreed to swap the bodies of 6,000 soldiers killed in action. And a fourth person has been arrested over arson attacks on property linked to the Prime Minister. A 48-year-old man was detained at Stansted Airport over fires at two homes and a car in North London last month. LBC weather, heavy rain and gusty winds pushing east across much of the UK tonight. Scattered showers to follow, but staying dry for the southeast. Lows of 6 degrees.
This is LBC.
Apply.
This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
6:36. Now, if President Putin has had some bad news today, we've been talking about that, he can turn for a little light relief to Poland, where a more pro-Russian figure has enjoyed electoral success. The presidential election has been won by the narrowest of margins by the populist right-wing candidate and committed enemy of Poland's moderate Prime Minister Donald Tusk. The new president, Karol Nawrocki, has what you might call a colourful past. He's never been elected to anything. He has been a football hooligan. He was such a fanatical supporter of Chelsea Football Club, he had it tattooed on his chest. He's a kickboxer and a right-wing historian. He has been accused and denied all sorts of allegations about connections with organised crime and prostitution. As I say, a colourful character. But what does it mean for Poland and for Europe? Let's find out more from Karolina Wigura, Associate in Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Oxford and co-author of The End of the Liberal Mind, Poland's New Politics. Karolina, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight. In short, this is a big moment in Polish politics and it's going to be in a pretty turbulent few years, isn't it?
Yes. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Yes, it is going to be a very turbulent time for a couple of reasons. Well, first, we may forget about the dreams to just easy come back to the status quo of the liberal democracy in Poland. So the government has planned a lot. It has planned to go back to the rule of law. It has planned to legalize abortion again. It has planned to lead a very stable pro-European politics. But it doesn't look like this anymore because Mr. Nawrocki, who has just won the election, will probably veto every of these initiatives, and he will also have his voice in the Polish European politics.
And what does Mr. Nawrocki mean for relations with Russia and for Poland's attitude to the Ukraine war?
It's a great question. Nawrocki, during the campaign, numerously underlined that he doesn't wish Ukraine to step into NATO or into the EU. So we might expect a rather reluctant policies towards Ukraine from Karol Nawrocki. This is point number one. Point number two, according to the Polish constitution, it's not the president, but the prime minister who is the dominant figure in the foreign policy of our country. However, the president has a strong voice, and it seems that Karolina has not a bad connection to Washington, D.C. and the new Trump's administration. That might mean more chaos and more noise in the Polish foreign policy.
And let's finish off, Karolina, by talking a little bit about the man himself. I mentioned a few things about his past which will raise eyebrows. It's quite hard to imagine somebody like that, as it were, coming from almost nowhere and winning an election. What do you think was behind his rise? Is it the end of that golden period in Poland when the country was growing and growing and growing and everything seemed to be getting better?
Well, let me just say that you have mentioned almost all colorful adventures of Mr. Nawrocki, and I was thinking, listening to you, well, isn't it also true about Mr. Trump? That there is a certain kind of politicians that tend to win elections, although they have colorful biographies, or perhaps because they have colorful biographies. Doesn't it really mean that this colorfulness that you have mentioned is actually a very good feature in a given politician's biography in the times of digital democracy and social media?
That's a very, very good point indeed. Karolina, thank you very much indeed for joining me on what has been a very important day for your country and perhaps a rather difficult one looking forward. Thank you so much. Now here, the revolution, it seems, will begin in Maidstone at the Kent County Council offices, where Reform UK promises an Elon Musk Doge-style attack on bloated bureaucracy. Zia Yusuf, the party chairman, said that Reform had created a British version of the US Department of Government Efficiency, or Doge, to cut wasteful spending of taxpayers' money. Starting, he said, with Kent, our team will use cutting-edge technology and deliver real value for voters. Well, we're all in favour of real value for voters, but a couple of problems occurred to me. First of all, the boss of the original Doge, Elon Musk, has just abruptly quit after managing to deliver only a fraction of the savings that he had promised. Second, given what he's said in the past about Britain and his general popularity here, is promising to copy Elon the shrewdest electoral strategy ever devised? LBC's Henry Riley was at the Kent press conference and he joins me now. Again, quite a remarkable, unusual moment in Kent politics. Did I call you Kent just now? I think I did.
It was rather unusual, and we only found out about it by accident, really. They were sort of hoping to sneak in this Doge team without anyone really noticing. And the reason they chose Kent, they control 10 local authorities, Reform UK, but the symbolism in the fact it was Conservative for nearly 30 years, it has the biggest budget out of all of their authorities. But we finally learned a bit more about British Doge, as they're calling themselves. And it's going to be led by a 28-year-old, the entrepreneur Nathaniel Fried, who we don't know an awful lot about.
That's very, very like what happened with Doge in the United States, with lots and lots of very young tech guys coming in from the outside, rubbing their hands.
Yeah, and that's what they say. They say that he's leading a team of young sort of data analysts, and it could even be younger than him, his team. We don't know. All I'm told is that there's 5 of them in total, and that Nathaniel Fried, the 28-year-old, is going to be the sort of leader of it. And they all posed, him and Zia Yusuf, for a sort of Avengers-style photograph on the stairs of Reform County Council. It was all quite strange. But I did speak with Mr. Yusuf, who was in that first Doge meeting where they were speaking about what they can cut, and he told me what came out of that initial meeting.
The first step is doing the analysis. Where is that money going? This is the mandate that we have from taxpayers who are seeing their taxes keep going up, and yet they feel like the services they're getting for those taxes seem to be getting progressively worse. And then, as and when we identify waste, Lyndon and her team will be able to make really good decisions to ensure that waste is eliminated, and she will share with voters and the public what they find.
Now, this crack team of Dogers who've got into Kent, they're going to start there. They're going to go on to other authorities. You may think they're sort of all fresh-faced, as we were saying, very young. Well, their chief advisor is Aaron Banks, who was also there today.
Aaron Banks, we'll remember him, yeah.
Who, as you know, has been sort of ubiquitous in politics surrounding Nigel Farage for the last sort of few decades. And he is their chief advisor. The hope is in Kent, lastly, Andrew, that they're going to focus on asylum seeker children's driving tests, which which they say is £20,000 for those who are aged sort of, 17, 18 pounds and learning to drive. They're going to cut that. They also are hoping to make more competitive sort of bidding for various contracts, including roads. So they say that will save money.
Because originally they were talking about DEI, diversity, inclusion and all of that. And there aren't actually that many people in county council offices like Kent working on that.
No, and indeed, if you look at some of the other things that they've mooted potentially axing, in some local authorities, they're talking about axing the flooding committee. So there's various savings that they are trying to make, but much like Elon Musk, as you said, some of them may prove to be very controversial.
Really interesting, Henry. Thank you very, very much indeed to that. Now, to dig more into that question I mentioned a little moment ago about the popularity of Elon Musk in this country and whether or not it's really a good idea to be seen to be copying him, let's hear from the director of More in Common, Luke Trill. Luke, is Elon Musk a popular figure in Britain?
I think we can say quite comprehensively no. In our latest polling, his net approval rating was minus 48, which was deeply underwater. In fact, he was only tied with Donald Trump himself, who was a similar level. None of our domestic politicians are at that level. In fact, Nigel Farage himself is far more popular than that. So I think associating themselves with Elon Musk is a bit of a risk for them.
I mean, part of the reason I ask, Luke, is they're not the only people associating with Elon Musk style or Trump style strategies, because the Blue Labour group inside the Labour Party has published a pamphlet saying that actually to win back pro-reform voters, Labour should take a sort of chainsaw to DEI or diversity and inclusion policies right across Whitehall and across public life. Is there any evidence that the public would actually like that?
To be frank, no. One of the things I always say to people is one of the biggest mistakes you can make in public opinion terms is assuming that the UK is the United States. We're not, and the British public think very differently. The American public were far less polarised, thank goodness. And when you talk to the public about EDI, around 52% say that it's a good thing. Only 14% say that it's a bad thing. And of those who've done EDI training, around 2/3 say that they found it helpful and useful. Now, look, people say it can go too far sometimes. Sometimes organisations get the balance wrong or the focus isn't quite what they'd like it to be and some of the terminology is a bit odd. But in general, that principle of, well, yeah, of course we should be doing equality stuff is strongly amongst the public. It's more about how you do it. And I think any proposal to get rid of it at all would fall on the wrong side of public opinion.
And you were mentioning throwing around all this jargon, which we've just been doing, talking with Henry here about Kent County Council and Doge. Is Doge something you think anybody here, apart from the political class themselves, have the faintest idea about?
I don't think it is. Now, look, one of the things I will say is if I ask in a polling question, should we do more to tackle government waste? As you can imagine, lots of people say yes to that. And they assume that, there's quite big savings you can get from waste. But we also ask people, in trying to change government or improve government, should we move quickly, even if we make mistakes, which I think we can say Doge has done in the US, or should we move slowly and be a bit more careful? 59% say they'd rather government moved carefully. Only 18% say move quickly, even if you make mistakes. So, Brits want a more cautious approach. They want to cut waste. They want government to get better, but they don't want, to use another example, the chainsaw that we've seen from the Argentinian leader used on government services.
Javier Millar, yes. Well, since I've got you here, Luke, we started the show today talking about this big defence review, and George Robertson, its author, gave a very eloquent and passionate appeal to people saying, if you want to be properly protected in this dangerous world, frankly, folks, you're going to have to pay for it. Now, as I understand it, what the polling shows is that we'll want more defence, but we don't want to pay the taxes that would fund it. Is that, broadly speaking, right?
It is. It's another area where the public are pretty cakeist, to be honest. We asked today, do you think the UK could defend itself if there were a war tomorrow, or if there were an invasion? 65% said the UK wasn't ready. Only 19% said it was ready. But when you ask, should taxes go up to prepare for that readiness, you then lose that support. So, yeah, there's a bit of a difficult circle for the government to square there.
Sometimes I think we're a pretty pathetic lot. Luke Trill, thank you very, very much indeed for helping on that. Now then, coming up, a new development into the investigation of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. We've got the details of that shortly, but the time now is 6:48.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
The Defence Secretary says the army will become 10 times more lethal as we move to a war-ready footing. Is the right amount of focus and of spending being put on our defence?
Ian Dale on LBC.
Apply.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:50. Well, tonight we've been talking about the need for greater defence of the UK and whether people will be prepared to pay for it. Luke Trill from More in Common, the pollster there, was suggesting that the polling suggests most people want the defence but don't want the taxes. But that's not your view. We've had some texts coming in. Ting sent us this text by WhatsApp. I would happily triple my taxes, says Ting, to make our country war-ready. And George says, hi, Andrew, of course, I would like to be taxed more for defence and security. Economic security and prosperity is hinged on the state of security. Thank you, George. If we do it, that's thank you, George Robertson, he's saying. If we do this right, we could also boost the economy with jobs and economic benefits from increased defence production. Scott in West Hampstead has emailed me to say my late father, a Royal Naval D-Day veteran, would welcome the recommendations of the Strategic Defence Review were he still alive today, but he would also want the government to fully fund all of the recommendations to keep the people of our country safe from would-be aggressors. Scott from West Hampstead and the rest, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, there has been another development in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, who went missing in May 2007 at just 3 years old. With German police announcing a new investigation into her case this week, our reporter Helen Hodinott has the details. Helen.
So, Andrew, it's been just over 18 years since Madeleine McCann went missing and more than 2 since any searches have been carried out. But this week, German officers, supported by their Portuguese colleagues, are set to search land between Praia de Luz, the holiday resort where Madeleine McCann vanished in 2007, and a house nearby where the prime and only suspect, Christian Bruckner, used to live.
He was a German paedophile, if I remember rightly.
Yes, so this is why the German investigators have been taking a leading role in the case. They identified him as the prime suspect back in 2020, and he is currently serving a 7-year sentence in Germany for the rape of an elderly woman at her home in Praia de Luz back in 2005. He is due to be released from there next year, and he hasn't been charged in the McCann case, but German officers have carried on investigating. 2 years ago, they carried out searches near a reservoir about 30 miles from Praia de Luz, and Bruckner spent time there between 2000 and 2017. He had photographs and videos of himself near the reservoir, but he's always denied any involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. Now, this new search is set to get underway tomorrow, last around 3 days, unless, of course, anything relevant is found, and officers will be searching a rural area with a lot of waste ground. They'll reportedly be checking things like like wells, ruins and water storage tanks, but it's not clear if they are just combing over old ground or acting on a new tip-off about where Madeleine's body could be. The Met says they won't be there for this search. They say they are ready to support their international colleagues where necessary.
Well, this has been a story of so many sort of false hopes and false starts, and it does send a bit of a tingle up the spine, this, however. Thank you very much indeed, Helen. A Turkish man living in the Midlands, Hamit Koskan, has been found guilty of a religiously aggravated public order offence after shouting offensive words about Islam and burning a copy of the Quran outside the Turkish consulate. Koskan, who's an atheist, believed he was protesting peacefully, but he was told his conduct was provocative and taunting, and that he had, according to the judge, a deep-seated hatred of Islam and its followers. He was fined £240, but free speech campaigners are worried that this is the thin end of the wedge towards a blasphemy law returning to this country. I think they're right to be concerned, and I'm joined now by the head of the National Secular Society, Stephen Evans. Stephen, it was a relatively modest fine. There's no suggestion of a jail sentence or anything like this. So why are you worried that this is heading us towards a blasphemy law?
Good evening, Andrew. Hi. I think this is a really disappointing and, as you say, I think it's a really worrying outcome for anyone interested in protecting the right to speak freely around religion and about Islam in particular. What this conviction, I think, suggests is that the act of simply burning a Quran in a public place is now criminal. So that seems like we've basically re-established blasphemy laws and expanded them now to cover Islam. It's worth remembering, actually, that the original charge levelled against Mr. Koskan was actually intent to cause harassment, alarm and distress against the religious institution of Islam. And I think that in itself is very revealing. Of course, we don't have blasphemy laws in this country, so the charge was complete nonsense, as we pointed out to the Criminal Prosecution Service. But what they did was came back and used public order offences as a sort of proxy, and I find that really troubling.
I mean, clearly what the authorities are trying to do is damp down any increase in sort of religious fury, if you like, in this country. You remember the Salman Rushdie affair, for instance, and what followed from that. But Lord Denning, who was, I think, one of the most distinguished judges in post-war history, said back in 1949 that he thought the offence of blasphemy was now a dead letter in this country. How wrong he has proved to be.
Absolutely right. I think what Mr. Koskan actually is being punished for here is the reaction of others. This became a police matter because Mr. Koskan was physically attacked for burning a Quran. A line from the prosecution, Andrew, that actually keeps reverberating in my mind is a line they said was he could have expected no less a reaction. So, you know, this is for burning the Quran. Hamit Koskan was spat on. He was violently attacked by a man with a knife. Is this really a reaction that we should now expect in a liberal democracy? And it seems like we're just being bullied into narrowing the scope of what is permissible expression in the UK. I'm not a favourite of book burnings. I don't think they're a great form of protest at all. I don't support that at all. But I don't think it should be criminalised.
Sorry, just to jump in, Stephen, it's the underlying threat of violence or fact of violence around this that makes you singled out Islam at the beginning of this. I wouldn't want to particularly attack any religion, but if I went and said something rude about Christians outside Westminster Abbey, nothing would happen to me. There'd be no physical threat. It does seem to be Islam itself, or Muslims in this country, who have threatened people and are, in a sense, looking for a special place in blasphemy laws in Britain as a result.
I think so. It seems that we're really surrendering our liberal principles to this blasphemy code, which is imposed not by the law until today, but by the ever-present threat of violence and intimidation. So I think that's where we are today, and I think it's deeply alarming that we're kind of, repurposing public order laws to replace blasphemy laws because we're so worried about what the reaction will be from certain elements of our society. And I think it's a very small element of our society, but religious extremists seem to be now dictating what we can and can't say, or how we can and we can't protest in the UK. And I think that's really concerning.
Well, the right moment to be sounding a warning klaxon. Stephen Evans of the National Secular Society, thank you very much indeed for that. The Strategic Defence Review was released today, outlining the vulnerabilities in this country's defence as the world around us grows increasingly dangerous. Lord George Robertson is one of the co-authors of the review and the former Secretary-General of the NATO alliance, and he told me about the scale of the threat.
We're facing an enemy that is working against us all the time. Cyber attacks, assassinations, election interference, disinformation campaigns. Our enemies are at our door. They're already there.
Worrying words, but wise ones. I will be back with you tomorrow. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the new LBC app, where you can read and watch the latest from LBC, put your news categories in the order you want them, pause and rewind live radio, and listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new LBC official app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. The Defence Secretary says the new era of threat presented by Putin's Russia means it's time to ramp up our defence spending now to avoid a hugely expensive war breaking out in a few years' time. John Healey says the armed forces need investment in new tech and need more people serving in them. But it's the right amount of focus and of spending being put on our defence at long last. On cross-question from 8, former Scottish Labour leader Jim Murphy, the Conservative Shadow Home Office Minister Harriet Cross, Green peer and former leader Natalie Bennett, and the Daily Telegraph columnist Ella Whelan.